vCenter Server Appliance. Hello everyone, this is the first video about vCenter Server Appliance. In the three-part series, I'll let you know what is vCenter Server Appliance, how you can deploy it, how to manage it using the console and web-based interface. So in this video, I'll show you how you can deploy the vCenter Server Appliance. So basically you have two options that are available when using vCenter Server to manage your virtualized data center. The first option is you can install vCenter Server on a Windows-based operating system, and the second option is install vCenter Server as a Linux-based virtual appliance. In this video, I'm going to show you how you can download and deploy a Linux-based virtual appliance which is called vCenter Server Appliance. Both type of vCenter Server are capable of providing features such as managing your inventory, distributed resource scheduling, which is DRS, high availability, which is HA, virtual machine migration, which is vMigration, and it collects performance data as well. Alright, so let's talk about the features of vCenter Server Appliance. So what is vCenter Server Appliance? What operating system it runs on? vCenter Server Appliance is a pre-packaged 64-bit application running on SUSE Linux Enterprise Server 11. So it's a Linux-based virtual appliance. vCenter Server Appliance has embedded database. With that you can evaluate the appliance, but the thing is, the embedded database which runs a PostgreSQL, it cannot run more than 5 ESXi servers or more than 50 virtual machines. Now in vCenter Server Appliance version 5.0.1 and 5.1 of the vCenter Server Appliance use PostgreSQL for the embedded database instead of IBM DB2, which was used in vCenter Server Appliance 5.0. So if you want to run more than 5 ESXi servers or more than 50 virtual machines, you need to have an external database such as Oracle database for vCenter Server Appliance when you're running in an enterprise. So vCenter Server Appliance, it only supports Oracle database as its external database. So you cannot run Microsoft SQL Server and IBM DB2 because they are not supported by vCenter Server Appliance. And you can configure the vCenter Server Appliance using the console or using the web-based interface. So vCenter Server Appliance supports AD as well as NIS authentication. Lastly, the vCenter Server Appliance does not support link mode configuration. So if you're planning to run link mode configuration with vCenter Server, you shouldn't use vCenter Server Appliance. Instead, you should use Windows-based vCenter servers. So let's talk about benefits of vCenter Server Appliance. So basically it's a simple deployment and configuration. You just download the appliance from the website and you import the appliance to an ESXi server, and then you configure the network and time zone settings. And if you want to configure more options with a GUI based interface, with a web-based interface, you can also use the web-based interface to configure the appliance. So basically it has a lower total cost of ownership. What it means is, you don't have to have a Windows based operating system and then install this appliance on it. So you're not buying a Windows operating system. Instead, you're installing this appliance which is running on Linux. You're installing this appliance which doesn't need an operating system, so it itself runs as an operating system. So there's no change in the GUI, in the user experience when connecting to the vCenter server with vSphere client. So using the vSphere client, you can get the same kind of experience. It'll be identical user experience. You'll still get the same options, icons, features, and everything else. So these are the requirements of vCenter Server Appliance. So for the disk space, you need minimum of 7 GB if you are thinly provisioning your disk, or if you are thickly provisioning your disk, you need maximum of 82 GB. And for memory, if you are planning to run 1 or 10 ESXi hosts or 1-200 virtual machines, you need to have 4 GB of memory. For 10 to 100 ESXi hosts and 100 to 1000 virtual machines, need to have 8 GB of memory. For 100 to 400 ESXi hosts and for 1000 to 4000 virtual machines, you need to have 13 GB of memory. If you're planning to run more than 400 ESXi hosts or 4000 virtual machines, need to have 17 GB of memory. And for processor, 2 virtual CPUs are good enough. These are the requirements of deploying a vCenter Server Appliance. There are other requirements for things such as Java Virtual Machine, memory heap settings, which is JVM memory heap settings. So for a vCenter server inventory size like 1 to 100 ESXi hosts or 1 to 1000 virtual machines. For Tomcast web server, you need 1 GB. For inventory size, you need 2 GB. For policy-based storage management, you need 512 MB. If you're planning to run 100 to 400 ESXi hosts or 100 to 1000 virtual machines, you need to have 2 GB of memory for Tomcast web server. And for inventory size, you need to have 4 GB. And for policy-based storage management, you need to have 1 GB. And if you're planning to run more than 400 ESXi hosts or 4000 virtual machines, for Tomcast web server, you need to have 3 GB of memory. For inventory size, you need to have 6 GB. For policy-based storage management, you need to have 2 GB of memory. Okay, virtual appliances file format. Virtual appliances can be downloaded in 2 different formats. They are OVF, OVA, or Vmdk files. So OVF file and OVA files, they are open virtualization formats. So OVF is called Open Virtualization Format, which contains only the metadata of virtual appliance, and it does not contain the actual data of the virtual appliance. So OVA file is the one which actually contains the data of the virtual appliance. So OVF file it's just a template file. When you import the OVF file, it will read the metadata of the virtual appliance, and then it will start to download the OVA file. Okay, Vmdk files. So in Vmdk files, you have system Vmdk and data Vmdk. So what is Vmdk? Vmdk is VMware Virtual Disk Format. So VMware's disk file which contains either system disk or data disk of the virtual appliance. So with these two files, you can easily import a virtual appliance into your vCenter server or into VMware Workstation. Okay, in this demo, I'm going to show you how you can download and deploy vCenter Server Appliance. So in my lab setup, I have a domain controller called DC and a domain called livemusictech.local, and I have a vCenter server which is called vCenter01. I have two ESXi servers. One is called ESXi 5A, another one is called ESXi 5B, and I have a virtual appliance called OpenFiler, which is used for our shared storage. Alright, so the first thing is I'm going to download the Ova file or the Ovf file. I'm not going to download the Vmdk files or the ISO or the zip files. For this demo, I'm just going to download Ova and the Ovf files. So we're going to go into the VMware website, and the website that you need to go into is my.vmware.com. As soon as you open the web page, you have to log in using your credentials. If you don't have one, you can always create one by clicking on register. So I already have a login ID, so I'm going to log in with my ID and the password, and I'll click login. Alright, from here I'll go into products and downloads, and I'll click all downloads. And I'll click on VMware vSphere. Alright, and I'll go all the way down under Enterprise Plus for VMware vCenter Server. I'll click View Downloads. Alright, now you can see here I have a section called VMware vCenter Server 5.1.0a Appliance, and under that I have the Ova file, the Ovf file, and the system Vmdk, and the data Vmdk, the ISO file, and the zip file. Like I said, I'm just gonna download Ova file and Ovf file. I've already downloaded the Ova and Ovf file. Alright, so I've downloaded and saved the Ova and Ovf file on my local disk C and in a folder. So you can see here I have the Ova file, which is of 1.90 GB, and Ovf file, which is 9.05 KB. Like I said, Ovf file only contains the metadata of the virtual appliance, so it does not contain the actual data of the virtual appliance. And the Ova file contains the actual data of the virtual appliance. So using the vSphere client or the vSphere web client, you can deploy the Ova file or the Ovf file. Okay, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna open VMware vSphere client, and I'll log into the vCenter server, which is vCenter01, with my domain credentials. I'll click login, and I'm going to show you the difference between the Ovf file and Ova file. Alright, as you can see, I have a data center called Bangalore, and I have two ESXi hosts. One is ESXi 5A, another one is ESXi 5B, and I have two virtual machines running under that. Okay, to deploy the vCenter Server Virtual Appliance, you'll click File and you'll click Deploy Ovf Template. Okay, so you'll get this wizard, and from here you can specify the URL to download and install the Ovf package from the internet, or you can specify the Ovf file which we already have downloaded and saved on our computer. I'll click Browse and I'll go into C drive and I'll go into the folder where I have saved the virtual appliance, and you can see here I have two files. One is Ova File and Ovf File. So let me select the Ovf file first. I'll click Open and I'll click Next. Okay, you can see here it got the template details such as the product name, which is VMware vCenter Server Appliance, and the version, which is 5.1.0.5200, and the vendor is VMware Inc. There's no publisher though, and the download size will be 1.9 GB. Size on disk, it'll be 4.2 GB if you want thin provisioning, or it will be 85 GB for thick provisioning. Now obviously, like I said, VMware vCenter Server Appliance will be running on SUSE Linux Enterprise Server 11. I'll click Next. Okay, now I can name this vCenter Server. I'll name this as vCenter 02, and you can specify the inventory location. So I want to keep this in the Bangalore data center. I'll click Next, and you can specify the host or cluster where you want to deploy this vCenter Server Appliance. So I'm going to select ESXi 5A and I'll click Next. Next thing is you need to specify a destination storage for this virtual machine. I would like to have high availability for this vCenter Server Appliance, so I'll click iSCSI 01, which is a shared storage. If you don't want to make this vCenter Server Appliance as a highly available virtual appliance, you can select a local storage, but in my case I'll just select shared storage, which is iSCSI 01, and I have enough space to store the virtual machine, so I'll just click Next. And for the disk format, you can either make it thin provision or thick provision. In my case, I'll select thin provision and I'll click Next. And now we can specify networking properties such as default gateway DNS, network 1 IP address, and network 1 net mask. If you are going to use DHCP, you can leave this option blank, but in my case, since I don't have DHCP, I'm going to manually specify all these parameters. So I don't have a default gateway, but I do have a DNS server, which is actually my domain controller. So I'll type my domain controller IP address, and for the network 1 IP address, I'll specify 192.168.10.7 as the IP address for this vCenter Server Appliance, and the net mask is 255.255.255.0. Okay, I'll click next, and you can see the deployment settings. Now remember, we selected a Ovf file. Okay, you can also power on after deployment, and if you click finish, it's going to download the Ova file. Since I already have Ova file, I'm going to cancel this. I'll go back to file, I'll click deploy Ovf Template, and this time I'll select the Ova file. I'll click next. Now again it will show the details of the Ova file. I'll click next again, and I'll name this as vCenter 02, and I want to keep this in Bangalore. So I'll click next, and like I said before, I want to keep this VM on ESXi 5A. I'll select that and I'll click next. And the storage, we want iSCSI because we want to make this virtual machine as highly available, and this iSCSI storage is a shared storage. So I'll click next, and for the disk format I'll select thin provision. I'll click next, and for the properties I don't have default gateway. The DNS server would be my domain controller's IP address, and the IP address for this vCenter server is 192.168.10.7, and the net mask is 255.255.255.0. I'll click next, and now here you can see the deployment settings. I'll check power on after deployment option, and I'll click on finish, and now it's going to create the VM for the vCenter virtual appliance. You can see here it's deploying the disk. Alright, it's almost done deploying the vCenter virtual appliance. Alright, there we go. It completed successfully, and I'll click close.